There is a video that circulates quietly on the internet. Not a highlight reel. Not a compilation of goals. It is a few seconds of footage shot on a cell phone somewhere in the streets of Vila Cruzeiro, Rio de Janeiro. A massive man, broad-shouldered, moving slowly through a narrow alley. Children running around his legs. Older men nodding at him from doorways. And he is smiling. Not the smile of someone performing for a camera. The smile of someone who has finally, after everything, arrived somewhere that feels like home. That man was once the most feared striker on the planet. The man that Gianluigi Buffon, the greatest goalkeeper of his generation, said he would rather move out of the way for than try to stop. The man that Inter Milan paid a fortune to keep, that Roberto Mancini called irreplaceable, that an entire nation watched and believed would one day be the best in the world. And then he was gone. Not slowly. Not with a dramatic farewell. Just gone. And for years, football told a very simple story about why. Alcohol. The favela. Poor choices. A wasted life. But here is the thing about simple stories. They are almost never true. And the real story of why Adriano disappeared from football is something far more human, far more devastating, and far more important than anything you have been told before. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Drop it in the comments right now, while it's on your mind. Do you think football ever actually tried to help Adriano? Or did the sport just watch him fall? I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this is the kind of story that hits different, subscribe, hit the like button, it takes 2 seconds, and let's get into it. To understand what happened to Adriano, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Inter Milan. Not to Italy. You have to go back to a place called Vila Cruzeiro, one of the most dangerous favelas in the north of Rio de Janeiro, in the early 1990s. Picture a maze of concrete and corrugated iron climbing a hillside, narrow streets that smell like diesel and frying oil and wet earth after the rain, children playing football in spaces that were never designed for football, between buildings, around corners, on surfaces that would destroy your knees if you fell. This is where Adriano Leite Ribeiro grew up. And this is where he learned to play. His father's name was Almer. Almer Ribeiro was not a famous man. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who worked with his hands, who lived inside the same walls that surrounded everyone in Vila Cruzeiro, and who had one singular pride in his life, his son. From the time Adriano was small enough to kick a ball without falling over, Almer watched. He was there at every training session, every youth match, every moment when the boy who would become a legend was still just a boy trying to figure out what he was capable of. Almer believed in Adriano before Adriano believed in himself. And that matters more than anything else in this story. Because the day Almer died is the day Adriano stopped being a footballer. He just didn't know it yet. And neither did anyone around him. But before we get there, and we will get there, and it will hurt, you need to understand what Adriano actually was on a football pitch. Not what you've read in a headline. What he actually was. Because the football world has a habit of eulogizing players after they've fallen. Of suddenly remembering the genius once the controversy is done. So let me be very clear about this. In 2004, Adriano was not arguably one of the best strikers in the world. He was not an emerging talent with potential. He was, by the only metrics that actually matter in football, goals, fear factor, physical dominance, the best number 9 on the planet. His left foot was not a body part. It was an engineering problem that defenders couldn't solve. There is footage of a strike he unleashed for Italy against England, a ball driven so hard and so perfectly that the physics of it still get discussed by coaches who use it as a teaching example. Buffon once said in an interview, without a trace of irony, that when Adriano wound up to shoot from distance, he didn't dive. He moved out of the way. Think about what it means when the greatest goalkeeper alive is telling you he'd rather surrender the space than risk being in the path of what's coming. In the 2004 Copa América, he didn't just win the Golden Boot. He won it in a way that made the other strikers in that tournament look like they were playing a different sport. He finished with 5 goals and was named the best player of the entire competition. He was 22 years old. Roberto Mancini, his manager at Inter, told journalists that he had never coached a player with that combination of physical power and technical refinement. Not before Adriano. Not after. Everywhere you looked in 2004, the same conversation was happening. Ronaldo was aging. Shevchenko was fading. And Adriano, this enormous, terrifying, beautiful footballer from a hillside in Rio, was supposed to be what came next. And then December arrived. And a phone rang in Milan. And everything ended. December 2004. Adriano got the call in Italy. His father had suffered a heart attack. Alma Ribeiro was 44 years old. By the time Adriano reached Rio, his father was gone. There are no words that cover what happened next. Not adequately. Adriano flew back to Milan. He trained. He played. He scored goals. On the surface, he was doing what professional athletes are paid to do, performing through difficulty, showing up, delivering. But his teammates noticed something immediately. Something in his eyes. Something missing. A quality of presence that had always been there, a kind of electric certainty that had made him feel dangerous even in warm-ups. It was gone. Not diminished. Gone. Like a light that someone had simply switched off from the inside. And here is where football failed him. Completely. Catastrophically. And with the kind of institutional indifference that only becomes visible years later when you can finally see the whole picture. In 2004, professional football clubs did not have the mental health infrastructure that some clubs have today. There were no grief counselors embedded in training facilities. There were no psychological support protocols designed to help a 22-year-old foreigner process the death of the person who had been the emotional center of his entire life. There was a training schedule. There were expectations. There was the implicit understanding, never spoken aloud but felt in every corridor of every football club in Europe, that whatever you are going through personally, you leave it at the door. Adriano tried to leave it at the door. For a while, he nearly managed it. But grief doesn't wait in hallways. It follows you onto the pitch. It sits next to you on the team bus. It is there at 3 in the morning when the city is quiet and the silence gets too heavy to bear alone. By 2006, the weight of it was showing in ways that couldn't be explained away. His fitness fluctuated. His performances became inconsistent. He began spending longer and longer periods back in Rio between seasons, not because he didn't care about football, but because Villa Cruzeiro was the only place on earth where his father's memory was still alive in the texture of everyday life. In the faces of people who had known Almer. In the streets where they had walked together. In the community that had watched that little boy become something extraordinary. The press had a different explanation. The press always has a different explanation when a black athlete from a poor background starts to struggle. It was the favela. It was the lifestyle. It was discipline. It was immaturity. It was everything except what it actually was, which was a young man in the grip of grief so profound it had separated him from the only thing that had ever given his life direction and meaning. His former Inter teammate Dejan Stankovic spoke about it years later. He said that the dressing room watched Adriano disappear and didn't know how to reach him. That they could see something was wrong, something deep and structural, not something a conversation in the locker room could fix, and they had no tools, no language, no framework for helping him. Mancini has spoken about the guilt of feeling he failed Adriano. Not as a manager. As a human being. That guilt tells you everything you need to know about what was actually happening. Inter Milan terminated his contract in 2009. He was 27 years old. The career that should have lasted another decade was effectively over. What followed was the slow geography of a player trying to find somewhere he could still feel like himself. Flamengo. Sao Paulo, Roma, Corinthians. 7 clubs in 6 years. Each one a new attempt. Each one ending the same way. There were moments. God, there were moments. A goal at Flamengo that had the Maracana vibrating in a way that reminded everyone watching exactly what used to be there. A performance here, a strike there, flashes of the old Adriano surfacing through everything that had accumulated on top of him. But they were too rare. And the gap between the player he had been and the player he now was had become too wide to cross consistently. He retired officially in 2016. He was 34 years old. No farewell match. No ceremony. No standing ovation at a packed stadium with confetti falling and a microphone in his hand. He simply stopped. And went back to Vila Cruzeiro. And here is the part of this story that football has never known what to do with. The part that doesn't fit the narrative of the wasted talent, the ruined career, the man who threw it all away. In the years since his retirement, Adriano has given interviews. Real ones. Long ones. The kind where someone actually sits down and asks him what happened and waits long enough to hear the real answer. And in those interviews, he has been something that nobody expected him to be. He has been honest. And the honesty is devastating. He said, and I want you to hear this exactly, after my father died, football lost its meaning for me. I played, but I was not there. I was somewhere else. Think about that sentence. I played, but I was not there. That is not the description of a man who stopped caring. That is dissociation. That is the language of grief so total it created a wall between him and everything he had built his identity around. He also said something else. Something that reframes every match, every season, every goal he ever scored. He said that he played football for his father. From the first time Almer took him to training as a small boy in Vila Cruzeiro, through the youth academy, through Serie A, through the Copa América, through every cold night in Milan when he drove that left foot through a ball and watched goalkeepers flinch, all of it was for Almer. To hear his voice on the phone after a goal. To know his father was watching from the favela and telling the neighbors about his son. To repay, in the only currency he had, the faith of a man who believed in him when believing cost something. When Almer died, Adriano lost his audience. And nobody, not his club, not his coaches, not his teammates, not the football federation, not a single institution in the enormous, wealthy, powerful machine of professional football, ever stopped to ask him how a person is supposed to keep playing when the most important person in the crowd has gone home for good. Today, Adriano lives in Vila Cruzeiro. He plays 5-a-side on the same kinds of streets where he first learned to love the game. He coaches children. He is present in his community in a way that wealth and Europe and professional football made impossible for years. And when you see footage of him there, that cell phone video, those narrow alleys, those children running around his legs, he does not look like a man who lost something. He looks like a man who finally found his way back to the only place that was ever really his. The real reason Adriano disappeared from football was not alcohol. It was not the favela. It was not a lack of ambition or professionalism or self-discipline. It was grief. Raw, unmanaged, unsupported grief. In a sport that still doesn't fully know how to sit with a human being in pain without demanding that the human being perform anyway. We lost one of the greatest strikers who ever lived. Not to the streets. Not to bad choices. To a phone call. To 44 seconds of a father's heart stopping in Rio de Janeiro on a December afternoon. And to the silence of an entire sport that watched it happen and called it a character flaw. He told us. In every interview, in every quiet admission, in every moment when he looked into a camera and tried to explain what had happened to him, he told us. We just weren't ready to listen. Maybe now we are.